Today I am joined by my colleague Faiza Rizvi, and we have with us Dr. Yusuf Al-Shamari. He is the CEO and head of oil research at CMarkits. He's worked as research fellow at OPEC and as a media commentator on global energy issues at the OPEC meetings. We're very thankful that Dr. Yusuf Al-Shamari could join us. I really want to start off by talking to you about, we know the significant impact of the oil industry's downturn. We know it has had an impact on the crude-dependent economies of the Middle East. Can you share with us a little bit of that impact in the region?
All right. Thanks for inviting me. As you know, the Middle East continues to be an economy that is mainly driven by oil, the oil industry. If you look at Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Emirates, and other countries in the region, in addition to perhaps Iraq and Iran and Libya, in fact, the whole of the Middle Eastern region. It's the region where you have the largest reserves of oil globally, and obviously it's a developing economy, and that's why it continues to be driven by the revenues driven from oil. In fact, most of the countries that make up OPEC are actually Middle Eastern countries. They make up at least more than 80% of the membership at OPEC. Of course, when you have an increase in oil prices, you will see the economies in the Middle East improving in terms of projects and employment and other economic growth trends. But when oil decline, of course, you would see some impact on the economy as a whole. I'll share with you what happened in Saudi Arabia, because Saudi Arabia is the largest exporter of oil in the Middle East. What happened since the decline in oil prices last March, because of the Corona pandemic first, and secondly because of the an agreement that the collapse of the Saudi Arabia, of course, and OPEC Plus didn't reach an agreement on curbing supplies back in March. Oil prices have declined significantly to less than $30. And of course, that decline in prices would lead to certain impact on the economy. So Saudi Arabia has taken several austerity measures, not just because of the decline in oil prices, but also because of the other adverse effects coming from the lockdown because of Corona issues, because the whole country went into total lockdown, and that certainly will have an economic impact. So just last week, the finance minister has announced several austerity measures in terms of raising the VAT from 5 to 15%, and taking off some of the allowances that government staff would normally take. So, in fact, this is not the first time Saudi Arabia takes austerity measures. If you look back in 2016, when, of course, there was also another price collapse back in 2014, but perhaps not as worse as this collapse. But still, we are used to kind of these, let's say, price collapse shocks. And as I can see now, as a result of the austerity measure, the country is expected to save up to 100 billion Saudi riyal. That's about between 30 to 40 billion US dollars. And of course, the kingdom it has got a financial reserve that it can always, that maintains its high credit rating. So it can always resort to financial tools in terms of issuing bond, in terms of having financial loans, until when you have the price of oil rising back again, that can pay off all these loans and maintain its credit rating. So I would say it's not the first time for the Saudi economy to face such issues, and I believe it will emerge of this crisis more and more resilient.
Dr. Al-Shamari, can you speak to Iraq? According to analysts, Iraq is one of the hardest hit nations of the region, with multiple projects on hold, I guess, due to all of the low oil demand. Do you expect the situation to worsen there in that area if prices don't bounce back in the short term?
I think so. Well, in Iraq, as you know, it's a slightly different region, because there you have also the issues in terms of maintaining the total stability and security of the region. It continues to be, the economy there still continues to be very much dependent on oil revenues in terms of building the necessary infrastructure for the economy. Iraq was exempted from, in the past, in the beginning of OPEC Plus agreements, was exempted from several cuts measures, and that's to support it rising to its, in fact, to support its rising economy. Perhaps Iraq, it's not just going to be Iraq. I think Iraq, Libya, Nigeria, and even Venezuela and other countries in at OPEC. Certainly, they will be hit at a much harder than other countries in the Gulf, and that's just because the economy of these countries is not as advanced as other countries in the Gulf region. For example, if you look at other regions like Emirates, like Kuwait, and even Saudi Arabia, they maintain the financial reserve, and that's what makes them much more resilient. But in Iraq or Nigeria or other countries, these reserves do not exist, and also the poverty, the income of per person is much lower than other countries, and that's why I believe if oil prices do not rebound back, perhaps they would have to take several austerity measures in order to try and minimize the expenses upon the country, and until that pandemic actually moves, they move out of that pandemic. By the way, it's they will not only face challenges because of the oil price, but also the health aspect, because we are in a crisis that is both economic and health crisis. So Iraq now is under total lockdown. Even if you go to several countries in Africa, and many of them are OPEC members. So that will also increase the burden upon these countries and I'm sure they will have to take a lot of, they will face challenges, and they will have to take several measures in order to emerge out of this crisis.
Thank you for that insight, Dr. Al-Shamari. And once again, thank you for joining us today. My question to you would be about the big move that came from Saudi Arabia on Monday, who announced deeper production cuts of 1 million barrels per day in June, in addition to the previously announced cuts, as we know. I'd like to know your thoughts on that, and how successful do you think this move would be in rebalancing the market?
All right. As you know, OPEC Plus back in beginning of April, after the collapse of the agreement in the beginning of March, did not, because there was no agreement on curbing supplies, and then because of the major collapse in the prices, the group has managed to reach a historic deal of curbing 9.7 million barrels a day. Of course, that will we will have to add to that about 5 million barrels coming from North America, and these we would say forced cuts, unlike the voluntary cuts from OPEC Plus. And the IEA has also committed to taking about 200 million barrels of crude into strategic petroleum reserve, and that gets translated into about 5 million barrels per day. Now Saudi Arabia just a couple of days ago announced additional cuts of about 1 million barrels per day. That will be about 30 million barrels per day in the total month of June, when this additional cuts will be implemented. In addition, Emirates will take 100,000 barrels, and Kuwait will take 80,000 barrels per day. In total, you will have more than 35 million barrels. If you look into the supplies and the demand in June is expected to be less than what OPEC Plus is actually not OPEC Plus, the global supplies. So I believe OPEC has this issue has triggered the attention of OPEC, and that's why they've taken that extra measures in order to avoid rising inventories, and that will make the let's say in order to accelerate the supply and demand balance, reduce inventories faster, and also not to delay the issue of supply and demand back into perhaps 2021. So I think that has been a major issue. Currently at CMarkits, we see inventories reaching to staying at least above 500 million barrels through the year of 2020. And with that extra measure Saudi Arabia is taking, and perhaps even when the group will meet again in June, Saudi Arabia, and as I heard that several OPEC Plus official delegates, they spoke to Reuters, and they are in favor of not scaling back the agreement as they agreed on in April. So they are in favor actually of maintaining the whole cuts without any ease. So I believe, and that's mainly because of the group that thinks that return of demand will take much longer because of the pandemic. And also, we don't want to see any price collapse happening back again. Even with this 1 million barrels, by the way, announcement, you see the prices rose a little bit, but still they are not high. And why is that? Because the traders are still concerned about the demand issues and oversupply. So I think that's the reason why the kingdom has taken that extra measure. And I believe it's an indication that the group may be in favor of maintaining the current cuts without any ease in the upcoming meeting in June.
Right, Dr. Shamari. But we all know the last few months have been one of the toughest for the oil and gas industry. But moving forward, with the OPEC Plus production cuts coming in and the gradual easing of lockdown all over the world, what's your take on the recovery of demand and oil prices in the second half of the year?
Okay, currently we see better than before demand recovery for road transport. As you saw in April, the demand for global demand declined by about 25 to 30 million barrels per day. And so in May, this demand actually is rising to about 83 million barrels. So there's like an improvement by about 5 million barrels per day. That's May demand. And that's mainly due to easing of lockdown issues that has happened in several economies, that mainly the EU and perhaps some states in the United States. And in addition to Asia, of course, as you see, China is currently coming back much faster than other countries because, of course, they had it fast. So that has pushed demand a little bit higher for road transport, but still the main issue is aviation, and aviation makes about 6% of the global demand. In fact, if you look at the total demand for transport that we expect this year for road transport is expected to reach 42 million barrels by the end of 2020. And that for road transport, but and that's still about 10% less than last year demand, which was about 47%. And aviation is not expected to recover until mid of 2021. So we expect demand to reach about 93 million by the end of by Q4 2020, and that will be about 7% less than last year demand. But one thing that we have to mention here is that demand can be higher than supplies moving towards the second half of this year. So we expect supplies to be about 80 to 85 million barrels, global supplies, and demand will be higher than that, will exceed 90 million barrels. So the markets will be oversupplied, but that oversupply not necessarily will increase prices because there's too much in the stocks. So that will enable faster withdrawal from stocks.
Right, you made a good point there. Well, Dr. Shamari, on one hand, we know the pandemic caused extreme demand destruction, but then the situation was worsened, if I may say, by the price war and the disagreement, like you said, between Saudi Arabia and Russia. But do you think the next OPEC Plus meeting could offer some relief for oil producers, the next meeting in June? And what sort of events can we expect would unfold during the next big meeting of the OPEC Plus?
What we expect for the next meeting is that we've seen some, because OPEC will always monitor the demand developments, and price, of course, plays a major role in that. As you see, prices now are still $30 because still the total lockdown measures, by the way, they are still in place despite easing of many countries. So I wouldn't expect OPEC to increase production or even ease production if prices continues to be at this level. And if you look at, of course, I don't expect that they will deepen the cuts, mainly because I think perhaps Russia wouldn't perhaps be in favor of making deeper cuts, because deeper cuts perhaps would increase prices, and then I think they will be concerned about perhaps rising of shale oil producers in the United States and the market share issues. But I believe demand will pick up. And I think OPEC Plus current cuts are certainly sufficient if demand comes back because of, as this virus still we move out from this corona crisis. So that's number one. I don't expect that they will ease the cuts, and I don't think they will deepen the cuts. So we expect maintaining the current cuts with perhaps, as we see some additional voluntary cuts from Saudi, from Emirates, so that's something we call over-compliance. Perhaps you would see some over-compliance from some countries, but the current cut, I think, will remain in place.
Dr. Al-Shamari, as oil prices of U.S. shale collapsed and companies shut in production, companies trying to kind of reinvent themselves at this moment, U.S. service companies like Baker Hughes, Halliburton, and Schlumberger, we've seen some of them express interest in expanding operations in the Middle East, possibly in the second quarter of this year. How successful do you think that initiative could be in the Middle Eastern region?
Halliburton, and many of the service companies have been in the Middle East for a long time. In fact, I am one of the Schlumberger employees about 15 years ago. And I think they are an important part of the oil industry in the Middle East, especially in Saudi Arabia. They have huge operations going on in terms of cementing, drilling, well constructions, wireline. You have a wide range of services that these companies are doing for the oil industry here in the kingdom. So I believe with the expansion of these countries, if they want to expand their operations in the kingdom, you would need to see expansion of operations. Aramco has announced major new fields in the northwest of the kingdom. And as you also, there is a new gas field in the kingdom that will start operation in 2024, and I believe it's one of the world's largest gas fields, called Al Jafura. So these companies, even if the kingdom, by the way, cuts its oil production, exploration and field development business continues for Saudi Aramco. And I believe they will always be in business, despite this, even if the kingdom reduces its production. Certainly, if the kingdom increases production, perhaps these companies will have more operations to do. And I'm sure they will always have an opportunity in the kingdom as long as the oil industry continues to develop. And the oil industry in Saudi Arabia will at least be for 50 years to come. Because Saudi Arabia, although it is diversifying its economy, but it still maintains large investments in its oil industry. And this is very important to maintain the security of global demand. So security of supply for global demand.
Well, we really appreciate your take on this and your expertise, and really you sharing all of that knowledge with us, Dr. Al-Shamari. We wish you all the best. Stay healthy and safe. And thank you on behalf of FISA and myself and Hart Energy.
Always a pleasure, Jessica and FISA. Thank you for having me.
For more Hart Energy videos, follow our